The early 20th century was a tinderbox of tensions in Europe. Rapid technological advancements drove unimaginable destruction, and all around the continent, people were desperate to figure out what the future held. Old regimes clung on for dear life, even as new ideologies rose, hungry for power. Nations that had been close neighbors for centuries suddenly turned into moral battlegrounds, where citizens felt pressured to declare allegiances. Families split over ideology. Nobody was safe from these divisions. Members of the same clan could end up on opposite sides of the political spectrum. And for one particular set of sisters, these rifts became legendary. They were the Mitford sisters, 6 aristocratic British women with shocking eccentricities, razor-sharp wit, and headline-making politics, who became infamous for their family feuds, their scandal-laden love lives, and their direct involvement with the most polarizing figures of the century. Yes, you heard right. We're talking about actual sisters, daughters of a peculiar English lord, who took dramatically different paths and ended up entangled with Winston Churchill, Adolf Hitler, the Communist Party, the British Union of Fascists, and more. Even if you've never heard the name Mitford before, buckle up because their story is bound to dazzle you with its contradictions. On the surface, these 6 sisters look like the height of aristocratic elegance, with lofty connections, exclusive parties, and endless columns in the society pages. But behind their glimmering public faces, the Mitfords were tearing themselves apart politically, morally, and even physically. The sisters were Nancy, Pamela, Diana, Unity, Jessica, and Deborah, born between 1904 and 1920 into the upper echelons of British society. Their father, Lord Redesdale, was energetic and full of theatrical flair, but surprisingly hapless with money. His finances fluctuated, forcing them to move around whenever mismanagement caught up. Ultimately, they settled in Swinbrook, Oxfordshire, in a home Lord Redesdale built himself. Growing up in the countryside, away from conventional schooling, the Mitford girls found creative ways to entertain themselves and amuse each other. They invented their own languages, formed secret societies in their shared bedrooms, orchestrated elaborate pranks, and teased one another in a never-ending swirl of inside jokes. Because there were so many sisters, they became each other's best friends, worst enemies, comedic sidekicks, and ideological rivals. Most of them were homeschooled, considered more proper at the time for young aristocratic women. This gave them abundant freedom to roam their father's extensive library instead of attending formal classes. One by one, they consumed a wide array of books from children's stories to high-minded classics, which helped them develop keen intellects, but also made them eccentric outsiders, strangers, to the more typical experiences of British youth. There were no routine interactions with kids from other families, no standardized lessons, no clubs or school sports. They were, in a sense, left to shape their own imaginations. By the late 1920s, it was obvious that each sister was determined to strike out in a different direction. Diana, one of the middle sisters, was known in her youth for her radiant beauty. In the late 1920s, she fell into the orbit of Brian Guinness, yes, from the famous brewery family. Handsome, sophisticated, and extremely wealthy, he swept Diana off her feet. She was just 18 when they met and 19 at their wedding in 1929. The union launched her right into the spotlight of glamorous London society. She and Brian lived in a gorgeous home near Buckingham Palace and threw parties that attracted the creme de la creme of the era's bright young things, such as Evelyn Waugh and the Bloomsbury set. They were, by all outward appearances, the ultimate golden couple. But for all the gleaming social success, Diana soon discovered that this glittery world felt hollow. She found Brian with his gentle poet's soul just a little boring. Beneath the shimmering facade, she felt a stirring desire for something more dangerous, more profound, and possibly more chaotic. That restlessness, combined with her fervent intelligence and fearless sense of self, laid a perfect foundation for her next spectacular leap, straight into politics and scandal. By 1932, Diana had embarked on a heady affair with Sir Oswald Mosley, whose personal magnetism was legendary. He'd started out as Britain's youngest member of Parliament and even served in government as a rising star in the Labour Party. Before abruptly breaking off to champion his own political movement, he created the British Union of Fascists, inspired by Mussolini's Italy. In short order, Diana left her wealthy husband, her high society lifestyle, and a big chunk of her social cachet to become Mosley's companion. She gave up the opulence of her marriage to Brian Guinness, moving into a modest Belgravia flat. Her old circles were scandalized. How could this aristocratic beauty run off with a renegade fascist politician and wholeheartedly adopt an ideology that was increasingly vilified at home? For Diana, though, this all made perfect sense. Life with Brian had proven too insubstantial. Mosley, by contrast, was a dynamic, forceful personality, passionately devoted to a movement that promised radical change. He was, she said, the one man she loved above all. It was a decision that would define the rest of her life. Meanwhile, the next generation of Mitfords was also stirring up trouble. Jessica, known by friends and family as Decca, was younger than Diana, but as fierce in her beliefs as the sister she'd once idolized. Jessica's vision, however, pointed in the opposite direction. She was drawn to left-wing politics and was enthralled by socialism and eventually full-fledged communism. Perhaps because she'd grown up watching her family's aristocratic traditions with disdain, she latched onto the idea of social equality and workers' rights. She wanted to help people on the margins of society to upend the complacent values she saw around her, and she was fiery enough to do it. In one of those twists that feel scripted for a novel, she ended up falling in love with and eventually running away with Esmond Romilly, who was her second cousin and an equally determined radical. Where Diana was marching in step with the black shirts, Jessica declared war on all forms of fascism. She was keen to live among the working classes, despite the fact that, as a Mitford, she was guaranteed certain social protections and privileges. Of course, another sister was Unity, who famously became so obsessed with Hitler and the Nazi regime that she moved to Germany, learned German, and positioned herself so she could dine within Hitler's orbit. Through sheer boldness and aristocratic brazenness, she charmed Hitler and the top brass of the Third Reich into letting her attend events, parties, and rallies, forging a personal connection with the Nazi elite. And yes, unbelievably, Unity convinced her big sister Diana to tag along, forging yet another direct link between the Mitford clan and the most reviled regime in modern history. Diana herself was at Hitler's side, meeting Goebbels, attending key events in Nuremberg and Berlin. In 1936, Adolf Hitler even served as a guest of honor at Diana's secret wedding to Mosley, which took place at Joseph Goebbels' house. Jessica watched these developments with revulsion. She'd once idolized Diana, but now she saw her beloved older sister as the epitome of everything wrong in the world. When Jessica fell in love with Esmond Romilly, the pair stealthily left England for Spain, where Romilly had volunteered to fight for the Republican side against General Franco's fascist forces. At first, they vanished without a trace. The Mitford family panicked, scouring every lead. Frantic letters were exchanged, phone lines buzzed. Winston Churchill himself was alerted. After all, He was connected to the Mitfords by marriage. He was a cousin of sorts to the sisters, and public concern ran high. People worried that young Jessica might find herself in grave danger. Eventually, Jessica's whereabouts became clear. She and Esmond were in Bilbao. They married in the south of France a short time later. The split between these two sisters deepened with each new betrayal. Diana busily networked with Nazi elites, promoting fascism in Britain, while Jessica was increasingly vocal about leftist causes. Europe tilted ever closer to war. Unity carried her fandom of Hitler to chilling extremes. As the German invasion of Poland loomed in 1939, Unity couldn't bear the thought of her two beloved nations, Germany and Britain, declaring war on each other. In a Munich park, she tried to end her own life by shooting herself in the head. Miraculously, she survived. The bullet lodged in her brain, leaving her with the mental capacity of a child. Diana's world collapsed when war broke out. She and Mosley were instantly under suspicion as potential traitors or pro-German collaborators. Mosley was arrested under wartime regulations, which allowed the British government to detain individuals considered security risks without trial. Diana was also picked up. Both were held under Regulation 18B with no formal charges, no clear path to release. By then, Diana had two small children, but that didn't spare her from spending years in prison, separated from her husband. Though conditions at Holloway Prison were grim, the experience only cemented her loyalty to Mosley. She emerged from prison in 1943 as unapologetic about her fascist leanings as ever. Jessica, now living in the United States, was equally firm in her beliefs. She publicly denounced Diana as a threat to national security, even going so far as to petition Winston Churchill to keep Diana locked away. For Jessica, fascism was the ultimate evil, especially after what her husband Esmond endured while serving in the Canadian Air Force. In 1941, Romilly died on a mission over the North Sea, a tragedy that further fueled Jessica's fury toward Diana, whom she identified as a symbol of all that Romilly had died fighting against. Jessica sank deeper into radical activism. She eventually married a left-wing lawyer named Robert Treuhaft, a man known for championing civil rights cases and representing clients in race-related and labor disputes. Together, Jessica and Robert embraced communism, lived in integrated neighborhoods, marched for civil rights, and devoted their lives to activism in America. Even after the war ended in 1945, the Mitford sisters found no immediate path to reconciliation. Unity had returned to England from Switzerland, but she never recovered. She lived out her final years mentally diminished by that bullet in her brain. Her death in 1948, at just 33 years old, was yet another painful blow to the family. But mourning Unity wasn't enough to heal the fractures. Diana remained in Britain, then later in France, living under a cloud of public dislike for her unwavering fascism and her cozy pre-war relationship with Hitler. Mosley's name was practically synonymous with British fascism. Jessica stayed in the U.S. and thrived as a crusading journalist. She rose to fame with her exposés and unflinching writing style, particularly in her blockbuster book, The American Way of Death, which tore into the funeral industry's exploitative practices. Some of the other sisters, meanwhile, pursued different paths. Nancy Mitford, the oldest, became a well-known novelist. She wrote thinly veiled stories about her family, books like The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate. These comedic yet edgy portraits of upper-class life drew heavily on the sisters' real experiences, albeit disguised under fictional names. Pamela tried to keep a lower profile, living a quieter rural life. Deborah, the youngest, eventually became the Duchess of Devonshire, transforming Chatsworth House into a successful modern estate and tourist attraction. But the tension between Diana and Jessica remained a brutal dividing line. Every few years, a new jab would come from one side or the other, often in the form of an interview or a letter published in the press. One sister called the other a dangerous Nazi. The other responded by branding her sister a reckless Marxist. The newspapers feasted on it. They did, however, share a brief moment of unity in 1973. Nancy was suffering from cancer, Hodgkin's lymphoma, and her health had deteriorated dramatically. The doctors had missed it for ages, and by the time they realized, it was far too late. Jessica returned to England from America, and all the surviving sisters converged for a final gathering at Nancy's bedside. By some accounts, Jessica and Diana were momentarily cordial, yet as soon as Nancy passed, they parted ways and resumed their feud. In truth, that single somber reunion couldn't erase decades of personal and political war between them. Diana lived out her days steadfast in her convictions. Even after the horrors of the Holocaust were fully revealed to the world, she never publicly recanted her admiration for Hitler, never apologized for her role in the British Union of Fascists, never gave the kind of full-throated mea culpa that might have allowed the public to forgive her. Many found her stance morally indefensible. Others claimed she had been naive, seduced by the veneer of powerful men or by the illusions of a big cause. Diana herself stuck to the line that what she and Mosley had wanted was peace and a united Europe, though critics pointed out that her version of unity always seemed to place Germany first. Jessica, too, refused to abandon her beliefs. She remained attached to socialist and communist ideals for most of her life, volunteering in progressive political movements, writing investigative books, and working as a journalist. Even in her older years, as she became more mainstream in her acceptance of Democratic Party politics, her rebellious spirit never left her. She had parted ways with formal Communist Party membership at some stage, but her impetus to question authority and champion the underprivileged burned strong until her death in 1996 at age 78. She passed away in California, a wealthy woman by then thanks to her books and successful public speaking career. But that wealth never diminished her radical edge. She once joked that if she ever got wind of having only a few weeks left to live, she would blow all her money on an all-out spree of mischief. In 2003, Diana also died at age 93 in Paris, never having offered any real retraction of her early life decisions. Their sister Unity had died decades before in 1948, leaving behind endless what-ifs. Nancy had passed in 1973, Pamela died in 1994, and Deborah, the youngest, in 2014. The Mitford sisters, all gone. Yet their legacy lingered, and still does. Why do they remain so captivating? For starters, it's a story that feels impossibly dramatic, stuffed with flamboyant personalities. They came from the same household and were shaped by the same eccentric upbringing, but they turned out so differently, striding off into the darkest corners of the 20th century in ways that continue to leave people shaking their heads. It's also a story about moral complexity. How does it happen that someone can cozy up to a figure like Hitler? On the flip side, what compels a young aristocrat to risk everything to fight in the Spanish Civil War, or to align with the Communist Party at a time when that affiliation could mean blacklisting and FBI surveillance in the United States? The Mitford sisters reflected the greater ideological struggle rocking Europe and the world at large. But because they were so brash, so public, and so flamboyant, they became a kind of microcosm, a single household playing out the drama of an entire continent. Beyond their politics, they were also good copy. Tall, attractive, witty, quick with a quip. They had nicknames and secret codes, wrote gossipy letters, and displayed a flair for the theatrical that turned every family meal into a kind of improvised performance. This performance eventually went global, with journalists and readers on both sides of the Atlantic spellbound by the unstoppable parade of Mitford headlines. Their individual stories, Diana's social leaps, Unity's mad devotion to Hitler, Jessica's rebellious exodus to America, were each riveting in their own right, and collectively they formed a swirling mass of scandal that refused to die down. To many, the Mitfords exemplify an unsettling question. If these well-bred, charming, well-read aristocrats could fall under the spell of extremist ideologies, isn't it possible for anyone to be similarly seduced given the right circumstances? They also show how family ties can be twisted by politics, turning sisters who once adored one another into bitter enemies. What does love look like when it collides with ideology? For Diana, devotion to Moseley overshadowed her relationships with her entire family. For Jessica, the memory of her late husband Esmond made her vow never to compromise with fascism. These are ideological collisions that seem unthinkable, yet they played out in real time between siblings who had once shared jokes, games, and the whimsical closeness of a shared childhood language. But it's not all gloom. Despite everything, the Mitfords had an irrepressible wit. Even in their darkest hours, they could be surprisingly humorous, exchanging sarcastic letters and comedic barbs. Perhaps that sense of mischief was a coping mechanism in a world that was often cruel and chaotic. Or perhaps the comedic flair was just an extension of their perform for each other, upbringing in that isolated manor house, forging personalities that thrived on attention. Even the tragedy at the heart of the story, the bullet in Unity's brain, the dead husbands, the prison terms, became enveloped in this swirl of larger-than-life drama that was so characteristic of the Mitford family. Jessica eventually wrote extensively about her upbringing in a series of memoirs, starting with Hans and Rebels. It was a frank account that enthralled American readers, with a behind-the-scenes peek at the Mad Mitfords, using real names and anecdotes that made her older sisters furious. Up to that point, Nancy's novels had portrayed them in fictional form as comedic or romantic caricatures. Jessica's frankness, however, struck them as a betrayal. They even squabbled in letters to literary journals, with Diana blasting Jessica's portrayal of the family as ignorant and contrived. But Jessica didn't care. She'd found her voice and a willing audience. By capitalizing on the public's voracious interest in her family, she became a significant writer in her own right, known for her investigative verve and dogged activism. Meanwhile, after the war, Diana did some writing of her own, but more in the realm of society columns and lifestyle pieces. She could be wry and witty, yet she steadfastly avoided the confessional style that made Jessica's writing so popular. In her final decades, Diana lived primarily in France alongside Moseley until his death in 1980. She continued to see people from her old society circles and cultivated an air of refined aristocratic style, even in exile, so to speak. There was no question that she had paid a price for her pre-war fascism, yet she never quite admitted regret. Some people visited her out of curiosity, others because they genuinely liked her personally or found her mesmerizing in an old-world, beautiful but dangerous way. She knew how to charm, how to make even her critics feel dazzled, at least for an afternoon tea. But once the conversation turned political, her unwavering stance sent them reeling all over again. In America, Jessica rose to new heights by throwing herself into the civil rights movement and the fight against police brutality and racial injustice. She marched, she wrote essays, and she worked with progressive organizations. She and her husband, Robert Treuhaft, were under FBI surveillance for their open communist affiliations. Yet they continued undeterred, believing that open dissent was a badge of honor. Jessica was, in essence, living out the flip side of the unstoppable passion that had overtaken her sister Diana. Only in her case, it was aimed at championing progressive causes. She refused to stay quiet, unapologetically pointing out inequities wherever she saw them. All these sisters, with all their brilliance and eccentricities, had enormous intellectual capacities and unstoppable drive, which they channeled into wildly different directions. That contradiction is precisely why their story is so compelling. They did not fade quietly into the background. They became, in some sense, living exemplars of the entire ideological rift of their age, from Hitler to Churchill, from Marx to Mussolini, from the Spanish Civil War to the Blitz over London, from lavish country manors to cramped working-class flats in Rotherhithe, from communist marches in California to black shirt rallies in London's Olympia. When we step back and reflect, the Mitford sisters serve as an improbable microcosm for how a seemingly sheltered family can fracture under the pressure of world events. They show us how ideologies can become personal, how familial love can be battered by the tides of nationalism, anti-fascism, personal ambition, heartbreak, and even the quest for social justice. In every period, there are families that divide politically, but seldom does one family produce not only a fervent communist and a self-declared fascist, but also a die-hard Hitler groupie who tried to end her life rather than witness a war between Germany and Britain. It's enough to make any fiction writer's head spin. Perhaps the real question that keeps us hooked is this: were the Mitford sisters unique because of their aristocratic background? Or could any close-knit family spiral into such extremes if given the same historical pressures? They wrote countless letters to each other, sometimes sweet, sometimes vicious. And those letters stand as a testament to how complex sibling relationships can become, especially when combined with the heated ideological struggles of the era. Their father, old Lord Redesdale, never fully recovered from his heartbreak over Jessica running away. Their mother was confounded by how her daughters, raised in the same environment, could end up on such violently opposed sides. Some sisters tried to remain neutral or simply live quietly, but the spotlight always found them in the end. In the final analysis, the Mitford sisters make for an unforgettable saga because they were never simple. They were witty but also capable of cruelty. They were intelligent yet sometimes shockingly unwise or willfully blind. They were extremely loyal to their personal causes, though that very loyalty could pit them inexorably against one another. And in an era that demanded everyone take sides, each sister did so with a vengeance, then carried that choice to the bitter end, no matter the personal cost.